Welcome back. You're watching All Angles. Now, the mining and agricultural sectors said that Transnet Strike will cost billions. But it's far from over as Satawu rejects the latest wage offer of between 4.25 and 5%. Meanwhile, the unions have agreed to rules of picketing at the CCMA. Let's discuss the kind of impact the strike will have on the economy. We've got the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa, Busi Mavuso. Thank you very much for talking to us this morning, Ms. Mavuso, and it's a complicated one because we have to consider the impact that the strike of this nature has on the economy, but also one would argue that the plight of the workers is a valid one in that they cannot live below inflation in terms of the increases that they would be getting. So how do we reconcile those arguments and try and find some kind of middle ground?
Yeah. And you're raising a very important point indeed, because all of us as South Africans are actually affected by the low growth environment, who are affected by the high unemployment, who are affected by the rising living costs. So it's not just the plight of the workers, it's the plight of all South Africans. If you look at all the social partners, labor is affected, business is affected, government is affected, and so is civil society affected. So I don't think that we can actually make it as if labor is actually living in a bubble. You know, they are the only ones affected by the rife economic environment that we actually find ourselves in. You know, businesses will tell you that they're actually taking a hit on their revenues, they're taking a hit on their bottom lines. You know, a lot of them, you know, as we have seen the unemployment having risen to 43% in terms of the expanded definition, are sitting in an environment where they can't even afford to keep their doors open, and they've actually had to let go of people. You know, government, if you were to speak to them, will tell you that they are suffering the same blight because, you know, tax revenues have shrunk. You know, a lot of companies have actually closed doors, which makes the pot from which they were actually getting their revenues much more lesser. If you look at what has happened in terms of professionals, you'll know that a lot of professionals have actually left the country, you know, in search of better lives. You know, when you look at how many immigrations we have actually experienced, you know, as a country in the last few years, you will see that it is a lot. And these are people who are actually economically active participants who are actually contributing in the economy. So that has actually impacted government. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that this economy is rough for all of us. The fact that our economic growth has not touched 2% since 2013 is an impact on all of us. The fact that the economic growth in real terms have not touched 1%, while we have had a population growth of about 1.6%, means that we are all affected by the demographic recession, you know, and the impacts of it are precisely this. You know, this is the reason why we are busy in the social compact discussions, which are meant to look at interventions that are actually supposed to accelerate the economic recovery efforts of the country, you know, and I really think that labor is currently acting in bad faith. You know, this is economic sabotage. You know, for me, it doesn't make sense. We should, all of us as partners, business, government, labor, civil society, we should all be coming together to look at what interventions do we need to put in place to ensure that we can actually turn the corner, to ensure that the expected economic growth of 1.9%, and thanks to the Transnet strike, that economic growth is not going to be 1.9% anymore. It's probably going to be about 1.2% or less, you know, because there's 8 billion worth of goods, you know, on a daily basis that are actually stuck at the ports, you know, and that is what we're actually dealing with here. So does it make sense to actually, you know, subject the country to this kind of economic sabotage when we know, you know, that we are actually in this dire situation, and when we know that we are currently seized with these discussions, you know, at NETLEC to try and find a solution of how we actually grow our economy so that we can absorb even more, even more workers that are currently not meaningfully participating in the economy.
That is a very important point that you bring up, and it's something that I wanted us to ventilate, you and I, this misalignment that the unions have with the state of affairs in the country at the moment, and really just the state of the government coffers. You've indicated in the note as BLSA that there's about 27 billion rand in tax revenue that the country is missing out on from the mining sector alone because of inefficiencies by SOEs. So when we consider consequences factors of that nature that I've just mentioned, how do we address this misalignment that the unions have with the state of affairs of the country as a whole, but also of the financial standing of the state, which is very dire, as we've seen over the last decade or so?
You know, for me, it is actually surprising, that Labour is currently playing innocent, as if they don't understand what is exactly at stake here. They know very well that institutions like Eskom and Transnet were heavily impacted by the state capture project. You would know that the Zondo Commission that sat for 4 years, 80% of its time was spent on Transnet and Eskom. That should give you an indication of how dire the impact of the state capture project was on Transnet. Hence, you're sitting with a Transnet now that is actually not operating efficiently, hence you're actually making the point around the loss of revenue, because the mining sector will tell you that because of the operational inefficiencies of Transnet, you're actually sitting in an environment at the moment where a whole lot of global cargo is bypassing the Transnet ports into the Maputo ports, but also look at how that is actually damaging our business case for investment, because we're trying at the moment to try and bring investment into the country so that we can experience the levels of economic growth that we actually want to get. We had an investment conference at the beginning of the year of about 333 billion rands, worth of commitments that we received. How is that investment supposed to come into the country where we can't even get the basics right, where you sit with load shedding of about 8 hours a day, where the rails are not functioning, where the ports are not functioning, where the roads are not functioning, where the municipalities are dysfunctional, where water is dysfunctional. And we know that we all have a job to do in terms of bringing about the reforms that are required to rebuild the country after it was actually damaged by the state capture project. So I think we all have to agree what is it that all the social partners are actually going to bring to the table. And I think we said it, after the state capture project, to say that these companies were ground zero for siphoning funds out of the state. So we can't be surprised now when they are actually struggling to function. We can't be surprised now when they are actually struggling to actually render and actually give the services that they were actually meant to give. The reform project is precisely about looking at how we actually capacitate these institutions so that they can actually operate at the level that they're supposed to be operating. And this is where the private sector is actually coming in, and hence we're actually talking about the PPPs. I think we are naive as a country to think that you can steal so much money, out of these entities and still expect them to operate as they should. So if we know that that is the basis from which we're operating from, where are we expecting Transnet to get 12%? But how do you also demand 12% in an environment where the economic growth in real terms has not actually reached 1%? How do you actually demand 12% in an environment where these companies are actually dependent on government grants to be actually to be functional? How do you demand 12% increases in an environment where Transnet is telling you that they are not even operating to their pre-COVID levels, which means that they still haven't recovered from actually the COVID pandemic. They still haven't recovered from the July riots. They still haven't recovered from the devastation, of the rains and of the climate crisis and issues that we actually experienced, heavy rains that we experienced in the KZN. So this is an ailing institutions, in all shapes and forms. So when you come and you demand which company is giving 12% increases at the moment, and the executives will tell you, the same way that the Eskom executives will tell you that for the past 5 years, they've gotten 0% increases because the company just cannot afford it. So when they are presenting a 1.5% increase and a 3% increase, and you will see that this 3 or 4% increase that they've actually offered, the CEO is actually saying that we will have to back pay that in 6 months, which means they are committing to funds that they don't have at the moment. They still have to allow themselves space to trade and to actually see if they can sell more products, for them to be able to generate the revenues so that they can actually pay the money. So if you understand that this is the environment that this entity is operating in, and let's agree that it's through none of our fault. It's not currently maybe the current government's fault. Let's say that. Maybe it's not the fault of the 6th administration. The state capture project, let's maybe put it to the 5th administration. It's not Labour's fault, I agree. It's not business's fault. So when you therefore exerting such demands, when we have agreed as social partners that ours is to try and ensure that we recover what we have actually lost in the past 10 years of the state capture project, that is for me is ludicrous. So I think I'm actually really questioning the lack of leadership of the union leaders at the moment when they know, that these entities were actually dealt a severe blow by the state capture project, by COVID, by the July riots. And at the moment, they're actually ailing and are depending on the same government for them to be able to function and operate as they should.
Ms. Mavuso, quickly on the issue that you've raised around Eskom, there is a new board in place. The executive remains as you got the opportunity to work quite closely with the team there. Are you hopeful that the new board in place is going to initiate any kind of positive change just because of what you saw from being on the inside in the time that you were?
I haven't followed all the interviews of the current Eskom chairperson, but he's been at Eskom before. He understands the environment, and I think they've already met with the current executive. And when you look at them, as individuals, they're actually very seasoned professionals, and they've set their sights, of actually ensuring, that Eskom is capacitated and it actually becomes stable. And I have no doubt whatsoever, that they're actually going to continue on the trajectory that has actually been set by President Cyril Ramaphosa when he announced the electricity crisis plan 2 months ago, and I think they are looking at within which framework, or they are looking at putting together a framework that will usher in, that electricity crisis plan that will hopefully see or make South Africa see the end of load shedding.